right. So as I was introduced, I do have a PhD in ecology, and I focus on landscape ecology, conservation, and pollinator communities, including monarchs and native bees. So the book that was up for a door prize, I wrote that to help people start to understand a little bit more about the ecological importance of various resources that pollinators depend on when they are trying to exist in urban ecosystems. So today I'm going to talk through a lot of the ideas that are covered in that book and some of the ideas that are covered in my upcoming book that'll be released next year in 2025 through Princeton Publishing. I just want to make sure I shared the right screen, that you all can see the PowerPoint presentation. Yes. Okay, great. So the outline for this talk is going to be about an hour. We're going to cover basic ecology and natural habitat succession. Then we'll move into some habitat management and nutrient cycles, and then ways to improve landscape designs to build habitat. Creating structure with natural woods, mulch, soil, and stone inside of our gardens, and then some seasonal maintenance, and then we'll open it up for questions. So for the ecoregion that we're working or talking about today, as most of you know, we're in the Balcones Canyonlands or the Northern Blackland Prairie of Texas. All of these areas, or both of these areas, have patch mosaic vegetation communities with herbaceous prairies, savannas, and forested areas that typically would be moving to the landscape naturally prior to Western colonization. Due to fire suppression that we typically enforce today with our management practices, in cattle grazing, honey mesquite, ash juniper, eastern red cedar, and a bunch of other fire intolerant species have now become dominant inside of the landscape, where previously they were not. And these kinds of changes throughout the landscape really have modified what we see as natural. And we'll talk about some of these processes later on in the presentation. So a typical model that people learn for habitat succession is that early on, if there's a disturbance, meadow plants like dandelions, coneflowers, milkweeds establish, and then shrubs come in, and that turns into a forest, eventually a climax community. Some type of catastrophe happens and everything resets. And although this is a good starting place for understanding succession, it really gives us the wrong idea of what is actually happening in the landscape. And a better model continues to move through time, but illustrates the resources that would be left from the habitat that existed there before, or the vegetation community that existed there before. So when a fire or a flood moves through a forest and turns it into a meadow again, there should still be standing trunks, there should still be snags, a lot of underground structures that we're not going to talk about. And then those resources feed nutrient cycles that then allow for the vegetation communities to succeed through their different vegetation communities, and the habitats and all the wildlife that should be living there move around the landscape as well. Another way to really think about this is when you learn about gardening or about habitat, quite often plant lists are focused on this type of habitat succession. However, if we're truly trying to create habitat in our gardens or our properties, we really do need to think about those resources that animals have evolved with and their life cycles depend on. For most people's pollinator gardens, we focus on meadow plants. And as you can see in this type of ecoregion, we should definitely be considering the non-floral resources like wood and soils, which we'll talk about as well. So if we zoom in a little bit and we see that a disturbance happens from a forest and it turns it into a cleared out area, annuals will start to establish, but so will wood and snags and trunks will be present. These decay as time moves on, feeding nutrient cycles, providing habitats for nesting organisms, hibernating organisms, and hunting resources for a lot of our insect eating animals. Similarly, inside of a meadow, what we don't typically talk about is that there is also succession of plants that live in meadows, where some of the more aggressive plants that we think of, like goldenrods, milkweeds, those are late meadow succession plants that are going or that have evolved to really compete with shrubs encroaching and tree encroachment. So that's why they're so aggressive and can really take over an area that we're managing to continue to be a meadow instead of letting it go into a shrubland. Typically, when we go into a natural area or look at our gardens, we manage it for that vegetation community. And those managed systems, like our gardens, even our national parks, suspend plant and habitat succession. In doing so, we're removing and regulating the interval of disturbance, and we're prioritizing the vegetation community over the ecosystem or the habitat that we're actually trying to promote. This allows for the habitats to slowly degrade, and it prevents populations from moving, which can allow for parasites and illnesses to build up inside of the landscape. Similarly, if we're looking at this picture that's here on the right, this is Lee Meadows. It's one of the places that I worked right after my master's, and this meadow has been maintained as a meadow for 120 years. The soils have been depleted. Plant diversity in those meadows is very, very reduced compared to the meadows that have been able to naturally succeed from fires back into forests. There's also the problem of invasive animals like horses and donkeys that come up and really trim everything down. So as we are able to recognize that these problems exist when we start managing the systems the way that we do, we can also start to recognize the actions that need to be taken to improve our management strategies. In contrast to that meadow, here is a meadow in the same canyon, same ecoregion that a fire went through 7 years before, burned out some of the forest, and you can already see trees are establishing that were over 10 feet tall. The shrubs were about waist high. So those meadows really should be a very different plant community. But when it's been maintained as a meadow for 120 years, those depleted resources really do start to show the signs of problems that they are creating. So once we realize that a suspended plant community is not allowed to succeed into its next steps, we know that there are going to be nutrient cycles that are broken and that populations are going to come into problems. So we need to monitor the populations and act. And this includes plant populations, so that if a late stage meadow plant like goldenrods becomes too abundant, we need to start removing parts of those areas so that we can maintain that high biodiversity that's going to create the habitat that we're looking for. We want to improve habitat with different intervals of disturbance. So instead of treating the whole area as one, it's really better to break it up. This way you can still prioritize the vegetation community, but you can make local populations move around a little bit and at least find cleaner habitats and avoid some of the illnesses and parasites that might affect them. For larger acreages, like in this picture here, this is a meadow. Disturbing about half of the area at a time is really good, but you don't want to simply just draw a line down it. Creating islands and pockets of undisturbed areas next to disturbed areas creates a three-dimensional structure that's going to help animals find shelter and be able to not be harmed by that disturbance, even though half that area is going to be harmed. And then recolonization can happen, and you'll keep cycles within a healthy balance inside of the landscape. Inside of our managed landscapes, the only place that we really see vegetation succession being allowed to happen is inside of our lumber plantations. And this is outside of Texas in Louisiana. This is just a pine plantation that's been turned into cattle pasture for a little bit. A similar structure where a timber operation went through, they were allowing the trees to grow back, and this will eventually turn back into a timber stand that can be harvested for its pulp that they were going for. So inside of the entire landscape that we're looking at in North America, when we start to really appreciate the agricultural impact that is existing and the urban expansion that is affecting everything, and realizing that the only place that we're really seeing this habitat succession happening is in our national parks where people don't go that often, or in lumber plantations, it really does start to paint a terrible picture of the balance that our ecosystems are in and the importance of adopting better management strategies that we'll talk about today. Outside of tundra, all ecosystems have transient vegetation communities. There are small and large droughts. There are wet years that are going to affect the establishment of plants and the mortality rates of plants. Fires, floods, migrating herds, those all affect the ability of plants to exist in the landscape, changing the overall community and creating shifts in populations. There's also pest outbreaks and the absence of ecosystem engineers inside of all of our landscapes. So if we bring everything together with the lack of vegetation succession that's supposed to be happening in our habitats and the extirpation of all of these wildlife that should be existing in our habitats, these animals are supposed to be browsing plants and spreading seeds, facilitating that succession. These animals also affect nutrient cycles that are now absent. Many of these animals affect hydrology, they create burrows, they affect prey behaviors. So when we're looking at a landscape like this, it's really important to wrap our heads around that although this is supporting a huge amount of biodiversity, it's still not in the right kind of balance that it's supposed to be because we've removed all of these megafauna that are supposed to be facilitating other processes. This picture is right outside of Austin. It is heavily dominated by honey mesquite, which shouldn't be there because this should have much more fire. There was also ash juniper in this landscape. It's not really captured in this photo. So from this, I don't want anyone to feel despair that the world is just screwed. I would just want everyone to kind of understand that what we're seeing as natural and what we're trying to emulate really is out of balance from what's going to create a truly healthy habitat and things that we can do to really help bring those robust habitats back on a small scale. So if we're trying to manage an area, some of the ways that we can rebuild the absent succession and the absent megafauna is to remove and create resources in similar fashions that should be happening in a natural process. So this includes adding wood to our meadows that should be present from trees dying off that would create that habitat. We should be trampling plants like large herds of bison would be doing. We should be spreading seeds and manures at various rates throughout the year because herds would move through, bears would be active at certain periods of time. All of these things really influence the landscape. However, we don't want to be too crazy about it because things are already kind of on that tedious level. So stay at less than 50% disturbance at any given time. You shouldn't just disturb the entire area in each year unless you are doing very early succession meadows. Herbaceous plant communities should be disturbed every 2 to 5 years to prevent woody encroachment. And then those disturbances can be rotated throughout to create a diversity that's going on. Again, you want to keep islands of undisturbed plant communities so that animals can find refuge and everything won't be taken at once. So with that very heavy bit of information, we can start to also look at nature and garden designs to hopefully pull some inspiration on what we're trying to create in our gardens and our acreages that we are in charge of. So the next few slides, we're going to walk through various natural areas as they exist today, talk about what's good about it, what's missing, and ways to bring it into the garden. So here's a photo from an urban lot where there are not any deer, there's no cows, there's nothing to really act as a megafauna. And you can see that there's clearly a lot of plants that's going to support some level of wildlife. There's plant diversity, there's strata, you have herbaceous plants, you have trees, shrubs, vines, everything's there. But there's not that structure that we typically see in large landscapes with large animals inside of it. And what happens with these animals being absent is you lose spaces for other animals to travel. We lose the ability for these plants to be smashed against the ground in the winter and new seedlings to pop through that vegetation. When they're left standing, that creates really shaded areas that stops a number of seedlings from being able to establish. There is an inability for birds to fly through here, an inability for bats to fly through here because it's too tight. And a lot of those animals actually prefer a more open system that is maintained when large animals are present and fire is present. In contrast, here is a large acreage that supports cows. It has Texas thistle. Again, it has honey mesquite because there's been fire suppression, but the structure of plants is still there. We can bring in that cleared browse line, the biodiversity of plants. This has open flyways for birds, bats, and all sorts of insects to fly through. So kind of bringing these natural elements into a garden and then organizing them just a little bit more to keep them aesthetically pleasing is going to be important, especially in more dense neighborhoods. Similarly, and this is in Louisiana, this is a wetland that's just between some crop fields. Again, this is going to support wildlife. There was an immense amount of amphibians and dragonflies that existed in this area. There's a high plant diversity. Again, we're seeing strata in structure. We're seeing a gorgeous water structure, great diversity in plant textures, woody resources for insects to use. But this also is absent of many of the megafauna that are necessary to create microhabitats that so many animals use. In contrast, here's a pasture land from that same area that has the large animals. So there's more clearing, still a lot of structure, still a lot of resources that animals can use, and things that we might want to emulate in our gardens. South of San Antonio, this was one of the areas I had to go survey. Again, gorgeous, beautiful structure happening, lots of biodiversity with plants. It's going to support a lot of wildlife. Large animals were present here, which allowed for the bare ground where bees could nest, various insects could bury into, lizards could sun themselves. We've got structured vegetation. Out more towards Fort Stockton, this limestone outcropping, again, we're seeing lots of plant diversity. There's definitely going to be wildlife. There's rock shelters, there's structured soil, and again, plant biodiversity that we would want to emulate inside of our gardens. The flip side of this is look at some of the roadsides right outside of San Antonio, where we see very, what's the word I'm looking for? Level plant communities. But there's still a lot of plant diversity in there. It's going to support wildlife. But this is being kept at this height for a certain reason, which is the safety of people driving in this area. So when we're looking at gardens and we want to make wildlife habitat, but also make something that's aesthetically pleasing, we want to follow a lot of the landscape design theory, which is to build structure with plants and rocks, modify plant structure with some amount of trimming, which is emulating the way megafauna interact with plants. And we want to have clear borders like mowed areas that are going to emulate paths, the way that herds would be affecting the overall landscape, rock outcroppings, however. And we want to make all of this useful for wildlife. Although these landscapes that are pictured here tend to be biodiverse in their plantings and their support of wildlife, they still end up lacking a lot of habitat resources, or the ones that are provided are not specifically provided for wildlife. And they kind of have to deal with that unintentionality of it. So a garden designed based on just native plants, in theory, looks something like this. But if we're really thinking about how wildlife are going to utilize it from day to day and throughout the year, we're going to have something that's much more robust, including below ground and above ground. Plant biodiversity is important, especially when we're talking about pollinators, but where do a number of our bees nest? Where do they overwinter? And that's underground, specifically in sandy soils, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. A number of our amphibians naturally would be overwintering in decaying wood, old tree stumps. Those are typically removed from our urban environments. Most amphibians need water resources for carrying out their life cycles, and we've removed that from our urban ecosystems. So by looking at small spaces and the areas in our gardens as the wildlife are going to utilize it, will really help us diversify and this space so that we have a more robust habitat that supports a higher biodiversity. Right outside or inside of Cameron, Texas, one of the native plant chapters designed this fabulous little park. This is a really good example of intentionally providing things for wildlife. There are clear borders, there's natural stone. The plants are organized by height. We're seeing the structures that we're looking for. There's some trimming to keep it organized, but that also is providing resources unintentionally for animals that need that browse line to enter into the plant for nesting or for laying eggs. There are key habitat resources like the bird box and the bird bath, but there's still a lot of room for improvement here. Many of the fossorial animals that are going to live on the ground, if these stones aren't moved regularly or if they weren't installed to leave gaps underneath, they will end up settling and animals can't get into shelter anymore. Water provided at a bird bath level is great for flying insects and animals that can climb, but animals like toads, box turtles, a number of insects, and even mammals prefer not to be exposed up here or simply can't reach it. So providing water at a lower level, at ground level, that's in a shallow dish, would be better for the overall habitat and the wildlife that they're trying to support. On the flip side of that same park, they do a very different design that shows the way to structure a native plant design in a similar way that a typical garden or a non-native garden would have been designed. This does not have the key habitat resources visible. It's not providing them, but it's going for a different aesthetic. And again, these would be simple to incorporate into it. It just needs some intentionality to it. So when we're designing our landscapes with native plant communities, we want to use native plants in the landscape as much as possible. We want to follow design architecture guidelines to create that beautiful aesthetic so that we're not getting tickets. Also, inside of our gardens, especially in more urban areas, we don't have the animals that are going to create clearings. So things just start to look weedy and overgrown. And again, without the animals creating the changes and the disturbances inside of these little habitats, we actually lose utilization because there aren't the flyways, there aren't the natural processes that will allow that system to really continue year after year. So I've touched on some of the removed habitat resources. We're going to revisit a lot of those and then go in depth on how to add them into gardens. Inside of our urban environments, we typically lack soil diversity. Depth, texture, and slope are all disturbed, especially in heavily developed spaces like inner cities and suburban housing tracts. Native plant communities, as we all know, are typically removed and become kind of a scarcity in the overall landscape. Ecosystem engineers, especially burrowing animals, are extirpated. Most people don't want large tripping hazards to appear in their yards. Caves and crevices are typically filled in. Large, clean temporary water resources, like ephemeral pools, are either removed or become heavily polluted. Wood, woody materials, and leaf litter are also typically removed. And we want to add all of these things back into the landscape. So if we start from the ground up, let's start talking about soils. Many of our native perennials have deep root systems, but a lot of developed spaces, especially housing tracts, no longer have these native soils anymore and instead have very modified soils and even foreign soils brought in. This can lead to problems when plants mature and will take an extra step when trying to design a native habitat. So if we're planting perennial plants that have deep roots, especially the upland plants, we want to make sure the plant beds are deep enough and not simply that 6 inches of topsoil that's quite often promoted simply because that's what agricultural plants need. We also want to make sure that if there are shallow soils, the plants can live there, because shallow soils for tall plants or plants that have deep root systems won't initially create problems, but over the years it can lead to sick trees and sick shrubs, and then the mortality of those plants. Similarly, in the natural environment, we have lots of soil types, and these form over decades and centuries from trees falling, from fires occurring, from burrowing animals. And in our urban environments, especially in our gardens where we don't want those burrowing animals, we don't want fire, we don't want trees to fall, we lose this very important disturbance. Loose soils are important for pupating insects like beetles, sphinx moths. Fires are important for organic material, nutrient bursts, seeding success. Falling trees create structure in the soil, new places for animals to nest. They create new topography for that changes the hydrology and nutrient levels, where spaces underneath the tree typically have less nutrients than the surrounding areas, again affecting the biodiversity of the habitat. Overall landscape processes are also going to affect the types of soils that are present. In natural areas and constructed areas, we, however, are starting to really become fond of this flatness. And it's because we go in with the machinery, we don't want that topography. It's a lot easier to mow when everything's flat and we get this really smooth surface. You can see it permeating throughout some of these landscapes. And even here in the top right, what you're looking at is an old stagecoach road from 1890. This place was no longer used starting in 1895, but the stagecoach road is still very compacted. There's no plants growing in this. It's now maintained for a path. The hillside was a sheep farm and is still very smooth. In older forests in these areas where you end up getting these huge divots from the trees falling over in the forest, you get the decomposition of these tilted root sets that create little mounds. And it really has an awesome topography to it that is absent. To really drive this point home, if you go out towards El Paso, you'll see in natural areas these little pocket prairies. And what these are formed when a creosote bush or some of the larger shrubs, they'll attract some burrowing animals like ground squirrels, pack rats. And when they die, that all starts to collapse. And you get these just small micro divots inside of the landscape. This little change in topography is enough to wash the seeds when it rains into these little islands and hold enough water there that everything germinates. On a scale where we have more rain, this isn't as severe, but these little micro changes actually create habitats that some animals are going to search out when they're trying to pupate. And if we simply just flatten everything out like we've been doing, we're really missing those microhabitats that are going to support that biodiversity that we want. Similarly, when we're removing burrowing animals, that loose soil is nutrient poor. It's important for a lot of animals that are going to try and burrow down and can't easily dig through the hard, compacted areas that happen as soils settle. For larger landscapes, if any of you have large acreages and you're trying to seed a bunch of areas, in conservation, we know that flatness is not a good thing. And typically we'll throw down what's called scrap. And these create microhabitats that allow trees to establish, shrubs to establish, divots and everything else create small wetlands for amphibians to breed in and various insects. So it allows for a much more diverse landscape with microhabitats that are important for supporting the amount of biodiversity that we're really trying to encourage in all of these areas. When we do not do this, we end up removing that biodiversity and getting simply a lower threshold, which is part of the reason that we're seeing so many declines in insects around the world, as well as the use of pesticides, fungicides, and overall habitat loss. Narrowing down into soils, the best way to describe soils is by their components. This is called a ternary diagram. And you can plot the percent of sand, silt, and clay on these axes to figure out what types of soils you have. In the studies for native bees, 70% of native bee species nest in the ground, but only about 500 species have had their nests described. And that includes ones that nest in twigs. Of those 500 and the studies that have been done, less than 25% of those studies describe the soil on what they were nesting in. That's a little bit of a problem when it comes to conservation, because if we don't know the types of soils that we're trying to emulate for the animals to carry on their life cycles, we can't recreate them. But there are some patterns we are starting to recognize that of those nests that have been described with soil textures, they really fall in this heavy sand soils as well as heavy clay soils. So by creating pockets of sandy clay areas with different levels of compaction, you will create different nesting sites for bees. Similarly, loose sandy soils are preferred for most turtle species for nesting, including snapping turtles. So if you have those in your areas and you're trying to encourage them, keep in mind adding sandy soils to the space. In a garden, it's simple enough to diversify our soils simply by planting areas like you would a 5-gallon or a 2-gallon potted plant, and just excavate that same amount of area, but fill it with the right kind of soils. Those soils do not have to be around plants. They can be under rocks. They can be under logs. They can be around the fence or even the foundation of your home. They simply need to be close enough to the landscape, close enough to resources that animals are going to use, that the animals can move between the two spaces. Similarly, if we're looking at rockscapes, Here's just a quick demonstration that typically rocks are placed in the ground without any consideration for how animals might use them, especially heavier rocks, which are allowed to settle and no longer provide shelter underneath them because animals can't get under them. If we're trying to create that habitat, though, and intentionally provide things, we can consider the soil underneath and how far that rock is going to extend. In some cases, if you're going to have a weed liner, you still want to make sure that right underneath the rock is exposed to the soil and the weed liner doesn't prevent any animals from getting in. We can then modify this column in just a few areas, either by providing more support for the rock and loosening areas underneath in the wedge, or creating columns of different soil types around it. All of these areas can be utilized for animals that need the soil types for overwintering, for their nesting resources, or what have you. But it's simply just being intentional to provide these sheltering resources so the animals can make their life cycle, make it through their life cycle safely year to year. And in doing so, that one rock that was provided before isn't just a feature, but it is now supporting amphibians, reptiles, and even mammals. Burrowing animals are missing from our landscape, and they are important for creating shelters for most wildlife. Especially during the hot summer, a number of animals, including box turtles, seek out abandoned burrows to get into to escape the heat. We can create these hideaways most easily in raised beds with strong walls, and whatever kind of cavity we're creating in the soil, we simply want to make sure there are strong walls that aren't going to collapse in a ceiling so that no animals will get squashed. The depth at which these should be buried is at least a foot or more of soil so that the sun doesn't bake the space, and in the winter it doesn't freeze. If we're doing tunnels with things like corrugated pipe or PVC pipes, the tunnel should be at least 2 inches larger than your target wildlife. I do want to provide a warning here, though, that no matter what kind of shelter you're providing for animals, it's not necessarily going to be for your target wildlife. Things like black widows will move in. The larger you go, the more likely different wildlife will use it. So I was working with a couple landowners who had a few acres. They wanted to create some fox dens. And we borrowed this structure, which is just an old dog kennel buried under some soil, and put rocks around it to hide it. Great for a fox den. Foxes could easily get in there. And I had to warn them, was like, there's no promise that foxes are going to move in. And sure enough, raccoons were the first thing to find that space and move in. Luckily, the landowners were excited about raccoons too, so things worked out. This structure that you see here is used quite often with tortoise conservation and burrowing owl conservation. And it's very simple to make. You just take an old dog kennel top, put it on the ground, cover it with soil, mulch, or whatever material that will insulate it, and then mask the front with rocks, and you can work it into the landscape. At some point, I will get this into the ground with a lot of plants and make a really pretty picture, but at this point, I haven't taken any photos of the two that I've installed, but at least people can see the idea of it. Caves and crevices that are in urban environments typically get filled in as well. And in our gardens, we can create both underground and above ground cave structures. Above ground rock piles, like you see illustrated here, are really great for lizards, trying to support toads. And again, if we diversify the soil underneath it, you can even create overwintering spaces for both insects and vertebrates. The important characteristics to include are going to be sturdy walls into ceiling. Adding loose soil on the bottom will simply just help animals be able to nestle in a little bit more. And then if you're trying to create vertical soils like you see here, it's best to do that on rock walls. Simply because the ability for soils to cave is problematic. There are some native bees like Anthophora bomboides and a number of wasps and even birds that need vertical soils for where they nest. So this is definitely a feature for larger landscapes to be considered, but maybe not the best idea for urban landscapes. Another thing that we can improve with landscapes is you might see these volcano kind of watering pits, especially in dry areas. And in really hot spaces, these naturally form because rabbits and tortoises and other mammals will excavate these areas trying to find cool soils in the shaded spaces. But we can also improve upon this because it is good for water capture, but it creates a tripping hazard, especially in urban environments. So in cities, you'll often find these grates filled with sand, which allow that root flare to exist to not rot, water to sit in there and percolate into the soils, but keep the surface areas flat so nobody's hurting their ankles. We can kind of mirror these two if we're trying to double up on space. And in a project I did in West Texas, the landowners had fruit trees and they'd done these volcano pits, but they were constantly filled with Bermuda grass. So to create wildlife shelter and prevent weeds, we simply took the two ideas, melded them together, put structures around the fruit base of the tree that's going to be pervious to water and allow animals to move through it as they see fit. We then covered this not so that soil or anything could be in there, but simply to create a structure that would support another layer. Put a rock boundary around that, added rocks to prevent any weeds from growing. This space was singing with crickets. After about 3 months, toads and lizards consistently came in and out of it, as well as wolf spiders and a number of other animals that the landowners were very excited to have around. Some people cringe at the idea of spiders moving in, but remember, spiders are an important part of the ecosystem. So getting wolf spiders and crickets to live in the same space is kind of exciting when we're looking at ecologically. Again, this from a gardening perspective is aesthetically pleasing. From a wildlife perspective, it's a really important sheltering space. So it's a win-win in the overall design. When it comes to native plants, there are a few things to consider when selecting native plants for an area. Whether or not you're in the range of where that plant grows, is it native to your area? As well as the plant's suitability for the site that you're working in. Many plants have specific soil requirements and lighting requirements, so they won't necessarily grow where you are working. It's also important to consider the growth habit of the plants, flower color, and bloom period, especially when trying to create a resource for a pollinator community. In addition to that, not all plants are built the same. So some pollinators prefer certain plants over other ones. And some plants, as many of you know, are host plants for specific insects or are fed on by specific animals. Many plants are going to provide berries or seeds that birds can eat and other wildlife can browse on. And it's also important to consider the plant's response to trimming. In most articles, when it comes to pollinator gardens, it blows my mind that purple coneflower is typically in those lists, especially if there's only 10 plants listed. In the book that was up for the door prize, it's one of the first books that really connects flowers with the bees that utilize them. So I filtered out honeybees and bumblebees from all of these reports simply because there are so many papers that focus on those two, on honeybees and bumblebees. Purple coneflowers have had a very small sampling or a small reporting size for native bees compared to things like firewheel or even sunflowers and whatnot. So this much larger list of bees shows that firewheel would actually be a better plant selection over Echinacea purpurea, for bees at least. Echinacea purpurea is really good for providing seeds for birds. It's also a larval host plant. So it is a great addition to a landscape, but it's not the huge workhorse that it's typically touted to be compared to other ones when it comes to pollinators. The response to trimming, like Texas sage, it does really well, typically heavily browsed. Berberis trifoliata, agarita, blueberries, American hollies, those all typically handle heavy trimming really well because they were browsed or are browsed regularly. Plants like sunflowers that don't like to be trimmed up so much. This is just a really great comparison of this landscape here. The owners were really going for kind of a more organized gardening situation, and they wanted a fence line of sunflowers. And without a little bit of planning, you can see how it kind of fell apart this year. But it was still really great for the wildlife and the pollinators. And I love this picture because it really shows the importance of planning and considering growth habit, the way things are going to respond to trimming, and whether or not it's going to meet the aesthetic that you're looking for. If we're looking at host plants for butterflies and creating a butterfly garden, we always want to diversify our plantings, and we want to spread host plants out throughout the yard. This is because caterpillars need shaded areas. And if you get a really good population of caterpillars, you can get defoliation. This will leave bare spots, and in some cases, the caterpillars will have gone over to another host plant simply to shed their exoskeleton or to even pupate, and they will now die of exposure because they're no longer in the shade. So it's best to have an integrated planting like this, where animals are more likely to find shelter outside of the host plants. It's also important to plant the butterfly garden or any kind of insect supporting garden away from areas where you're going to be using pesticides. Around our house, we do apply flea and tick sprays at the base of the house, so I never put our pollinator gardens around the foundation. Always move them out to beds that are a little bit further away. If you have problems with deer, as people were talking about earlier today, deer cages are a really good option. The best way to support plants and deer with deer cages is to put the deer cages at a radius from the plant that the plant will still be able to grow into, and put the leaves past the fence line. And then the deer will browse to that fence line, but the plant will be protected and not fully decimated, which will still allow it to support birds and insects and other wildlife within the habitat. Inside of our urban environments and many of our suburban areas, typically large, clean, temporary water resources are removed. If you want to create these, the best way to do it is to create deep basins with rough edges that will allow animals to grab on and crawl out when it's filled with water. You want to use native plants that tolerate inundation. If you go onto the USDA plants website, you're looking for plants that are going to be listed under the wetlands tab as FAC or FAC wet. Those plants will do well in dry conditions and seasonal wet conditions. Some plants that fit this are red maple, cardinal flowers, swamp milkweed, and buttonbush. If you're trying to provide water for toads and frogs or any amphibians, emergent plants are important for most of those animals to lay their eggs, to at least capture them. You want to make sure that there's no fish and that there's a low flow for most of our native species. Mosquito dunks are becoming very popular. They do not directly harm living amphibians, but they do kill flies, including mosquitoes, rat-tailed maggots, and a few other aquatic flies that will simply reduce their populations, but it's a much better step than the broad pesticides that just kill everything. Similarly, small juveniles, when they first emerge, like toadlets and froglets, need smaller insects. So if you have the ability to create small compost piles near the wetlands, it will help fruit flies and other smaller insects kind of colonize that area and provide food for your amphibians and help them make it into their adulthood. Typically, our management strategies remove wood and leaf litter. Some of the ways that we can incorporate this into our gardens is by creating log borders or mulch borders. You can also create mulch piles and tuck them away behind plants, or have them on centerpiece if you really like them. One of the ways that we introduce wooden resources into our gardens, and many people don't even realize that that's what they're doing, is by installing bee hotels, bird boxes, and shelter boxes for various wildlife. Bee boxes or bee hotels are emulating the tunnels that are left by wood-boring insects, typically beetles, that bees will come in, find, and lay their eggs in. Unfortunately, on Amazon and at some of the big box stores, these bee hotels are often for sale, but they're too short. When the tunnels are too short, the sex ratio of the offspring is heavily affected. And this is because bees can control the sex of their offspring. And the females, when they're building these nests and providing for them, lay female eggs deeper into the tunnels. And then the last few cells are going to be male. Some of the thought process behind this is that the males are expendable, they can be fed to the birds can eat them. But you can see that in these longer tunnels, you typically have 2 males to 8 to 10 females. It's a very low number. And then those males are able to mate with all those females. When this is out of skew, you then have females being overly harassed, and it can lead to death and mortality rates in those females before they're able to start pollinating or providing for their own offspring. So it's important to make sure that we have the right structure of bee hotels. Inside of the book that was up for a door prize, I have this design that's in there. I use this for my grad school research. And it comes in 2 different layers with a 9-inch tunnel at 3/4 of an inch. No, half an inch, and then 4-inch tunnels with 3/16 of an inch. And these support 2 different types of bees, with a lot of your leafcutter bees ending up in here, and some of your Calides ending up down here, as well as some Ceratina. So, moral story, don't buy these short boxes that are typically available, but purchase the ones that are made specifically for our native bees, or build them yourself. Similarly, you can create shelters and resources with log piles. This is some of the areas that I was doing work in conserving in Westchester, New York, where we had to cut down a lot of trees that were invasive. We simply piled different stacks of wood, but created rooms like this for possums, raccoons, coyotes, and foxes to nest in that were quickly used. Created hollow boxes, but you can also simply just buy bird houses for different birds. The Audubon also has a fantastic book for bird houses that support different species and the designs for each one of those bird boxes. Woody materials in the natural settings, when they fall over, also are feeding the nutrient cycles. They're creating that soil topography, creating new shelter resources, and loose soils that animals can then get into for pupation overwintering. One of our native bees, Agulchlorata, nope, that's not right. Metallic green sweat bees, Agulchlorella something. Not important. They actually need severely decayed wood for overwintering. They'll nest in freshly decayed or freshly dead wood to heavily decayed wood, but all of them overwinter in very damp, heavily decayed, like you can pull it apart kind of wood. They need that for their overwintering space. You can also add this resource with adding bird boxes, as discussed, hollow logs for many of our mammals, as well as pupating insects, including Luna moths. Species of plants with thick bark that peels off is important for a lot of butterflies and beetles, including mourning cloaks, which will spend the winter there and then fly out, which is what butterfly houses are supposed to mimic, but butterfly houses don't do a good job of that, and most butterflies will not utilize the butterfly houses. Similarly, piles of mulch will typically be utilized by snapping turtles and other turtles for nesting habitats, which always surprises landowners when they dig in and find baby turtles. So for replicating the absent megafauna, it's important to add in some of the small scale disturbances. Some things to consider is looking at the landscape to identify what resources are missing. As we've done so far, look at the fresh meadows or the meadows that are being maintained and ask yourself, are logs, are wooden resources, are snags supposed to be present? If they are, add them. Is there supposed to be stones? Is there supposed to be soil topography? Is there supposed to be standing water? Whatever it is, look at the resource and consider if you want to add it to your garden. Then you want to make sure that you're refreshing those resources at a regular interval that kind of mimics the natural process. So if you're putting logs in your meadow, replace them every 8 to 10 years because they're going to decay, and you're going to want that fresh wood for many of the insects that are going to be utilizing it for their nesting sites. It's also important to disturb logs, stones, and soils. Every once in a while, lift things up and move them around a little bit. Most smaller objects that we can move would have been tipped over by bears, bison, raccoons. They move things around, and that movement stops those objects from settling and creates microshelters that animals use on their day-to-day for shelter. Um, just to walk us through the effects of the absence of one animal, we can look at bison. Bison historic range was literally from the northern edge of California into Mexico all the way to the East Coast. They were important for trampling plants. They migrated throughout, creating heavy levels of trampling at a time as the herd moved, or dispersed trampling as they fed. Bison typically eat second-tier growth of grasses. They are creating spaces for animals like serratina bees to nest. They are removing that aerial vegetation so that seedlings can establish. They were, defecating, creating patties that were spreading seeds and feeding nutrient cycles. They would lay down and flatten out large pieces of vegetation. And they would create browse lines. Even though they weren't typically feeding on those shrubs, they would still get on against the trees and rub. And for some reason, bison are very itchy. If you've ever had the experience of working with them, they rub on everything. So they help remove a lot of that vegetation on trees so that there's still flight areas and places for animals to move around. We can emulate this by making sure that we're cutting back herbaceous growth, especially in the non-growing season, by 25%. We can trim back grasses and herbaceous perennials in winter by about a third of their height to keep the support for the next year's growth, but to keep that area open for new seedlings to establish and soils to warm up. I think this is the last part that we're going to talk about. Pesticide use is also just off the charts, and most of it doesn't need to be done. Typically, not even typically, when we're talking about pesticides, we are discussing herbicides, fungicides, insecticides all together. Some of the research that I've worked on has shown that the synergistic effects of these chemicals together, even though the insecticides are the ones that are supposed to target insects to kill them, they're not the only ones that are doing it. Fungicides are creating the inability to produce their cytoskeletons, which is allowing them to not molt and is causing some animals to be deformed. It's allowing for their immune systems to be harmed and pathogens to be able to attack populations. So it's really just a death of 1,000 cuts when we're using pesticides. So where you can, avoid using them. Try and reduce the amount of herbicides you're using, try and reduce the amount of fungicides you're using, and try and reduce the amount of insecticides. Of course, there are times to utilize these chemicals, but for the most part, we don't need to apply them to everything. So the best thing you can do is to reduce your use of pesticides. Some of the other things that we can all do is join local land protection groups, join local advocacy groups, including the Native Plant Society that you all are a part of. Push for local policies to include more native plants and habitats in parks, industrial landscaping, and neighborhoods. Work with HOAs, cities, counties, whatever agencies you have the access to adopt policies, ordinances, and laws that are nature friendly and that will also reduce pesticide use. So I hope you all learned a lot from this presentation. I hope you have new ideas to maybe bring into your own landscapes. I'll read through this real fast. So just the takeaways from this are our gardens are out of balance and they require management. And our overall landscapes are out of balance and just need a little bit of a thought shift. Landscape designs can create habitat that are still aesthetically pleasing. They simply have to include thoughtful use of native plants. They have to incorporate diverse soils. They need to include shelters, rocks, water, and wood, and they should be mimicking the absent animals and natural processes that should be present. Look at some of your native plants and actively trim them up. Replicate the grazing. It's okay to shape and sculpt plants that are typically heavily browsed. They're still going to support the wildlife as well as look intentional to other neighbors in the area. And then, of course, get involved. And with that, I will open up the floor for questions. If you all loved this book, feel free to access it or review any of my presentations on YouTube. I will admit that this book, I had to publish it myself because I'd never done it before. It was a learning curve. The photos aren't great, but the information is dense. And everyone who has read it and met me has told me that they've learned more from that book than they ever thought they would. And then next year, I have Habitat and Homes, a conservation approach to gardening coming out, and you can look for that as well.
Yeah, but step up to the Zoom. So anybody else with questions, feel free to head up there.
Or just do it till
Hello, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. But I was wondering about the replicating the grazing, restorative grazing. I'm incorporating that in the garden I'm involved with. And the question seems to keep coming up. How often do we do that? And also, a little embarrassed, how do you duplicate the defecation? Let's just say.
Great question.
Because, I mean, we're doing what we're doing, but we can't restore it back. And I will step down so that they will pay attention to you on the screen. Thank you very much.
Yes. So that's a great question. The frequency in which you want to replicate grazing is going to depend on the plant species that are present. So if you have a plant that is heavily pursued by herbivores, you can trim that back as often as that plant is able to regrow. Typically, though, that's not necessary. So you can simply just trim back plants, every year, or help them. Sometimes give them a Chelsea chop to help those animals, or to help the plants have the support that they need so they don't become leggy. For replicating the manure aspect, simply spreading manure every 2 to 5 years in the landscape, or using even nutrient teas from compost. You can add that to the landscape. You can either do it all at once if you want to, or just do it in isolated patches, throughout the year, and let that decompose. And as it's been worked into the soil by your invertebrates and your soil organisms, then you can, do it in another place. That's up to you, 100%. The more frequently you do it in the isolated patches, you will be supporting a higher biodiversity, though, compared to if you did it as a flat run, one time every 2 to 5 years.
First of all, Susan said thank you. And I just wanted to piggyback on her question to include native grasses. Should we trim those back ever so often? How often do you think? All at once or patchy?
Yeah, so I always recommend doing things in patches. So depending on the species of native grass, typically if you're trying to emulate like bison, they don't eat things down to the ground. They leave a little bit of aerial structure. With plants like Gulf Coast mully, it gets really leggy, but if you cut it at about 6 to 7 inches, it will maintain those stems at the base and then grow new shoots that are then supported, and you can keep it trimmed up. That provides a shading space around the base of it for that clump, as well as just create that fountain look. Little blue stem, bushy blue stem, on the other hand, you can cut those things off at the ground and they're going to continue to grow pretty much straight up. So look at the way the plant is growing and then augment how it's being trimmed based on that. Does that answer your question?
We got a thumbs up.
Okay.
There was a question on chat about if you could elaborate a little bit more about the rocks around the fruit trees.
Sure.
I understood why, what the purpose was. And
So in that circumstance, it was in more West Texas. And what's happening is there's a volcano underneath to hold water that could be filled with water, and then that would percolate down into the roots. But in doing that, it was also providing a space for weeds to grow up, and you couldn't get in and weed whack because that could harm the tree. And the landowner wanted a solution. The landowner was also trying to create habitat for wildlife. So by creating that space that's then covered with the cardboard and then putting rocks on top of that cardboard, we were preventing any plants from growing, but also creating a layer where the water could sit and still percolate in the soil that stayed damp enough for crickets, for toads, and other invertebrates to live in that space. And when it did get too full of water, they were able to escape because of the way that everything was laid in there. You can do this in wetter areas too, probably not with the same amount of water holding capacity. You would actually probably want to break that volcano a little bit because you don't want that soil to get too waterlogged, but it would still create that shelter around it that's going to stay damp for the animals that need that cooler, wetter space in the overall landscape.
Do we have any more questions for Dr. McCoshum? Well, I would like to thank you for coming tonight. Thanks for a very informative presentation. You touched on several topics that I don't know that we've heard about in our meetings, so appreciate bringing something new to the group. And I'd like to thank everyone who is, oh, we got one more question.
they're asking if most of this presentation is in the book.
They're asking if most of the presentation is in your book. I believe you mentioned that the presentation was loosely based on your book.
Yes, the majority of the topics that were discussed today are covered in the book, except for the absence of megafauna. That's the next book.
Okay, wonderful.
Sure, I was just curious. Do you live in this area?
We have a question about where do you live? I think you mentioned you were in Corpus right now.
I currently live in Corpus Christi. For the last 7 years, I was in Odessa, and I work as a wildlife biologist for consulting firms. So I pay my bills by doing consulting work for solar farms and wind energy construction.
Mickey, just when I originally asked him to come and do this presentation, I believe you were in North Dakota doing pollinator surveys. Is that right?
Yeah, for the threatened Dakota skipper.
So he gets to do all kinds of conservation traveling.
Yeah. And also with the inviting pollinators and other wildlife into your garden, I do have other free presentations online. So the book is unfortunately expensive because of the way Amazon works. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you don't want to buy the book, I totally understand. Purchasing the book just helps me fund my side projects on research that I still continue with native bees and monarchs.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to everyone for coming and for your presentation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Also, just so it's not a complete mystery, here's what your audience
Oh.
looks
Hi, everyone.
like. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. And again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. Bye. Take care, everyone.